Here's a story I got back in September, and I love this story. The man who wrote it did a great job describing everything that happened. He writes, "The following is 100% true. This encounter took place on October the 6th, 2005, in the desolate desert of southern Utah. My late wife and I were to meet some friends for a multi-day hiking trip through some slot canyons. For those who are not familiar with what a slot canyon is, it's a narrow sandstone canyon formed by water runoff with vertical sides. By narrow, I mean some areas are several feet wide, and while others are barely large enough to fit yourself through. It's common to crawl, climb, and rappel your way through, and sometimes swim scattered pools of standing cold water left over from the storms. This particular hike we were doing is well known for having these cold pools of water. My wife wasn't keen on that part, so she and I opted to hike in a different way and joined the rest of the group halfway and hike out together. The very nature of how these canyons are formed is why you do not want to be in them when it's raining. Storm water moves swiftly through these canyons and immediately becomes a deadly flash flood. Often the walls are sheer and vertical, so there's no climbing out for escape. In fact, every year people die when entering these places without concern for the weather. For this outing, the weather had been clear for days leading up to our planned departure and was predicted to be a storm-free night. Also, there is no cell service in much of this area, so you're on your own. Self-sufficiency is expected. Our original route traveled through one slot canyon and met up with another slot canyon and carried on further south as a tributary to a larger reservoir downstream. Looking at a map, it would look like a capital Y where these two canyons came together. The west entrance is more technical and takes more time to traverse, while the east entrance is largely a sandy wash bottom and can be traveled much easier. Basically, it's like walking on a beach. Just upstream of where both canyons meet is a clearing wide enough to camp away from the wash. That was the place where we planned to meet the others. The main group set off on October the 5th with plans to meet us either late on the 6th or early on the 7th. My wife and I planned to leave our home and get to our meeting point all in the same day, so we set off on the 6th. Getting to the trailhead for us required a 6-hour drive, then about 8 miles of hiking. As usual, we were running late, so by the time we were on foot with our gear and in motion, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The hike was incredible. The 200-foot wide wash slowly narrowed as the miles went by, and halfway we were walking through areas where we could almost touch both sides. The colors would glow especially strong as the sun lowered, making some of the hallways glow in ways not thought possible. It was the golden hour. We were progressing well, spirits were up, the map had us just about to the confluence. Suddenly we were rocked by the awful stench of death. The canyon walls were over 400 feet tall, and the canyon was 10 to 15 feet wide, and that stench was so concentrated you could almost feel it, yet there was no sign of where it was coming from. Nothing. Nothing in sight on the ground, up or down the canyon, and with near vertical walls, we were really confused. We kept on using our shirts and whatever else to filter the air as the canyon continued to twist and turn. And then there it was, a full-size adult mountain sheep or ram, just a few days dead. I say a few days because that was the time since the last storm flooding in this canyon, and the carcass wasn't covered with runoff debris. It was obvious it had showed up afterward. Our suspicion was it slipped and fell down into the canyon from above. The gender was impossible to determine because the entire abdominal area, ribs to pelvis and all the way to the spine, was missing. Not to say the entrails were strewn about in the process of being devoured or in decomposition. It was outright missing. All of it. The head was turned away and down into the crevice between the ground and the wall. Once we identified the source of the stench, we quickly ran past it to get to fresher air. Just as we were clear of the odor, we walked right into the confluence. The joining of 3 400-foot-tall large sandstone hallways was an awesome sight. I stood in the center and I looked straight up to see the sky in the shape of a Y, and I could tell that we needed to find a spot to camp soon. Luckily, the clearing where we were camping was just a few hundred feet away up the West Canyon. To our surprise, the West Canyon was wet, meaning it had a small amount of water flowing through it. So much so that we were jumping from sand mound to sand mound trying to keep our feet dry. We weren't concerned with flooding because we were confident with our weather forecasts, and it's also common to have water springs or seeps in the desert canyons. As we walked through a particularly narrow section along the way, the walls gradually widening to around 200 feet with large sandy banks on both sides, and they were gaining elevation safely away from the wash bottom. We chose to stay left as we hiked upstream and found a clearing large enough to camp for the night. It was about 20 or so feet up from the wash bottom and about 30 feet away with small trees and bushes between to give us a little privacy. After setting up camp, we had just enough light left to look around a little. I personally wanted to see if anyone else was around that we should be aware of, and just as I hoped, we were alone. It soon got dark, so we started back to our tent. It was then we took notice that as we walked along the wash, our footsteps sounded like a splat, splat as we stepped. I remember jokingly telling my wife that it would likely wake us up should our friends arrive before we got up the next morning. Before long, we were zipped in our tent and down for the night when just minutes later, out of the pitch black night, we were met with an absolutely insane roar coming down through the canyon. It was of such volume and force that we were instantly beside ourselves with fear bordering on outright panic. Everything about it seemed impossible. The sheer capacity to create such a sustained volume was outside my understanding. Out there, at worst, maybe you would see a mountain lion or a black bear on a very rare occasion, but nothing that would compare to the combined guttural roar of an African lion mixed with that of a silverback gorilla. What still has my head spinning is the duration. It spanned almost 10 full seconds with no change in intensity throughout. Instantly, we knew, first, we were not alone as previously thought, and second, we were definitely not on top of the food chain. It was then that I took notice of my wife, who at the time was having an absolute meltdown. She was yelling and squirming around in her sleeping bag as if she was possessed. It was everything I could do to get her to try to be silent, and as I held her down with both arms and a leg so we could hear. Easier said than done, but done nonetheless, and there we sat holding each other in our tent, whispering and wondering what the hell was happening. My wife, having grown up on a farm, told me she had never heard or known of any animal that could make that kind of sound except on television. I'm a city boy, having spent most of my youth mountaineering, and I've met up with mountain lions, black and brown bear, moose, wolves, and whatnot, and I was absolutely stumped. Neither of us had a clue what could have made that sound. So we lay there in dead, pitch-black silence for around 10 minutes when I eventually mustered up the nerve to sit up very slowly. My mind kept racing around for anything that we may have had with us that could be converted to a weapon of defense. The 2 metal bars in my internal frame pack, a 3-inch pocket knife, tent poles, a rock. I didn't find anything that I thought would keep whatever this was off of us if it attacked. Suddenly, whatever this thing was showed up. As I sat in the dark, something very large and very fast ran down the wash coming toward us from the upstream at my left, passing in front of us and to my right, out and down toward the confluence, and it did it in 7 unmistakable bipedal steps. It was pitch black, and I stereophonically heard the splats of the steps that had to have been more than 15 feet apart as it ran past me, no more than 30 feet in front of where I was seated. The creature made a breathy, gruntal sound almost matching the pace of its steps and had passed through the 130-foot clearing in under 3 seconds. If we were scared before, it was nothing compared to how we felt now. All we could do was sit and wait, and that is what we did for hours. I don't remember when we finally fell asleep, but I was sure wide awake when my wife started packing to leave at first light. I spent a few minutes looking around in the daylight trying to find anything that would give me an indication of what it could have been, but I didn't find any footprints, and my wife was making it clear she was leaving with or without me. I think it either climbed out of the canyon or it was stepping in water the entire time. I don't know. What I'm confident with, however, while not having seen anything, I know what I heard, and that is enough for me. And our friends that we were to meet up with, they were delayed with minor injuries. There was absolutely no keeping my wife there a single minute longer than necessary, and I wasn't about to let her walk out alone. I left markings in the sand wash bottom and put a note for our friends in the hiking register before informing the ranger at his station that our friends were still out there. He said another ranger was making the trek that day and he'd let him know to keep an eye out. It turned out that our friends were around 6 hours behind us when they called. They claimed they neither heard nor saw anything out of the ordinary during their entire trip, and that a few nasty blisters were the reason they decided to leave early. Stranger still, they all say they didn't see any dead animals along the way either, while I clearly remember taking notice that the sheep had not changed in any way when we ran past it again on our way out. We still haven't told those guys anything about our experience that night. That is one awesome story, brother. I really appreciate you sending that in. The way you set it up and described your hike in, coming up on the carcass of the ram, and then the stories was superb. And I just wanted to tell you how much I appreciate the time you spent and the way you described all this. I know everyone enjoyed it. Thank you a lot, brother. Okay, that's just one story for this video. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you guys on the next video. Thanks a lot.